Welcome everybody to the Boston Office 365 user group. All right, we're going to kick it off. As you can see on the screen here, we have social media accounts. You should check us out there. It's really cool. Our Twitter account actually tweets out a whole bunch of updates all the time for things that Microsoft is announcing all across, I think it's 23 different product teams that thing follows. So lots of cool info there. And we are getting caught up on our YouTube backlog. So you can catch a couple of new videos there. And we hope to be caught up relatively soon. So we are working on that. All right. Our organizers are Mr. Dimitri, myself, and Mr. Bill, who is also on the call. If you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out to any of us. If anybody's interested in doing a presentation for this user group, please feel free to reach out to us and let us know. Also, if you guys have any ideas for presentations, let us know. We'll find somebody who can do it. So last month, our friend Dimitri gave a presentation on getting started with Power Automate Desktop, the robotic process automation, or formerly known as robotic process automation. It was an excellent presentation. Thank you for doing that, Dimitri. Very lively debate going on in the chat, and lots of good stuff covered in there. All right, so since last time, we're going to dive right into some updates. Don't usually do a lot of stuff with Office. We don't usually cover a lot of Office applications in here, but I wanted to call this out just because it seemed like something. I know that there's a lot of public speakers that attend these meetings, so this was something I thought would be super helpful. We're getting modern comments in PowerPoint. Modern comments are going to give us the ability to do app mentions, anchor comments directly to specific slides, and also have a resolve button. Microsoft has officially slated this for June. I noticed, and you can see in this screenshot here, that the app mentions and the anchors are available now for targeted release. I do not have a resolve button yet in targeted release, though. So hopefully by June, we'll see that. I think that'll be very welcome change for people that are coordinating decks with lots of different people. Super helpful. All right, so Teams. We got a bunch of updates coming to Teams. Microsoft is increasing the meeting and chat participants to 1,000. The webinars rollout, which had started a while ago and was then put on pause, has now been restarted. So webinars are now coming out again. And just to recap, the primary difference between a webinar and a live meeting is a webinar is going to provide you a registration page. So you can actually manage tickets and things of that nature. That's the biggest change. There's a couple of other really small differences, but the big one is the registration change, the registration page. The share content layout has changed. They now, instead of giving a huge list of all of your different applications that you have open, all of those are being consolidated into a single item that you then have to expand, which caught me off guard at the beginning of this one. We also have a hard video mute is coming. We have that pictured here. That is not out yet, but should be coming, I believe next quarter is when that's slated to come out. And also coming soon, channel renames will finally rename the corresponding folders that are created for sharing files. So I know that this is something that drives a lot of people crazy, and there is supposedly a fix coming for that. So that will be very nice. Also coming in June, we are going to get a public preview option for Microsoft Teams. So what this means is basically if you opt in for some of the public releases, things like first release, or not first release anymore, targeted release, your Teams application will now also be coming out with those targeted releases as well. So we'll get previews to the Teams functionality as well as all of the SharePoint and other fun stuff. If you do that with Office. Also, the big one that I wanted to talk to you guys about is the SharePoint app bar. This is currently rolling out and will be available in all modern pages throughout your online tenant. The SharePoint app bar will have 4 buttons that have global navigation, sites, news, and my files. So it's going to be really similar to what was on the SharePoint landing page. But the difference is you'll now have one click to be able to access all of this from any of the modern sites. The other big difference is this global navigation option. So the first button there, that by default is a little home, can be updated if there's a couple of caveats here. You have to have specified a home site within your tenant. And as of the recording of this video, that is still only available via PowerShell commands. I believe Dimitri, let me know if I'm incorrect about that, but I'm pretty sure it's only PowerShell that can be used to enable that right now. But once that's enabled, when you go to that site, a site owner will see this option that I have as the first screenshot up top here. I activate my pointer. There we go. So once the home site is enabled via PowerShell, then if you go to that home site under the site settings, you'll have this option here to enable global navigation. And when you enable global navigation, you'll have up to 3 different ways that you can configure that. And what that will do is basically mirror the navigation that you have for that hub or site right within this. So it's basically a way to give us more navigation. It's a new layer of navigation that's being made available to us to use across the entire suite, which I think is a very welcome change. So, does anybody have any questions about that? Questions, comments?
I like the updates.
Yeah, good stuff. All right. All right. Well, that's it for updates.
Really quick question, Mike. So on the global navigation, I was able to enable that. I guess I'm the early adopter, or whatever.
Yeah.
I was able to enable it for myself. Obviously, the rest of my tenant did not get it. Is there going to be any kind of a problem with the fact that I've enabled it and configured it on my tenant when it actually does roll out for real? Have Microsoft made any changes? Remember, they pulled it back for some reason.
No, as soon as they can see the bar. So when you enable it, you can't enable it per person. So
No,
if
I know.
you've enabled that, you've enabled it tenant wide.
No, I realize that. But the reason I'm seeing
So,
it rather than everybody else is because of what my account is set to. I
right.
get early
Yeah.
stuff.
So within your tenant, most likely you're one of the accounts that is listed to be allowed to see the targeted releases,
Exactly. Yep,
whereas
exactly.
others aren't. So as soon as Microsoft rolls this out to general release, then that's when everybody else will see it, and they'll automatically see it configured with your global navigation because you've already taken care of that.
Well, I guess my only concern is that Microsoft changed something versus what I configured back in February when I first got this. Remember, they were supposed to launch this, I think, by April or May, and then they pulled it back.
It's been postponed and rescheduled a couple of times. I mean, if it's still working for you, then it should be fine. There's certainly no harm in going in now and double checking it.
Yeah.
You know, there might be some other settings, or there might be some wonkiness in the settings if you were playing with it in that very first release. So yeah. Yeah, and that kind of goes for anything when we're playing with the anytime we're messing with targeted release stuff, and then Microsoft pulls back on something when they re-release. Yeah, it's always a good idea to go in and confirm those settings upon the re-release, because when they have those kinds of issues, the settings that you put in may not always have been migrated to whatever changes that they made. Or there might be settings that are completely different than what you had the first time. It's always an adventure.
Hey, Mike, I have a question along that same line.
Yeah.
So I was looking at this today, matter of fact, and our QA attendant has just showed up, and my team was wanting to customize it, and the documentation is a little bit confusing. In that it says, it looks like the customization, well, you can disable it now, but that ability will go away in October. And it kind of alludes to that you'll be able to customize it. You have any thoughts or comments on that? Or is that just meant to be nebulous?
Yeah, I haven't done a deep dive on that particular thing, but I actually noticed that as well. And they talk about customizing it, but I think what they really mean is what you need to do is customize the navigation of the communication site that you have designated. So they mentioned 3 options here, but I only know of 2. And the only 2 that I know of, there's one where you can set, when you enable it, you have 2 available to you if the site that you have designated as a home site is also a hub site.
Yeah, Mike, just
2 options there. You can choose between the hub navigation or that site's local navigation.
Yeah, Mike, just to jump in here.
Sure.
So currently there's no specific documentation for how you can customize anything. And I think saying anything more would be breaking NDA. So I'll leave it at that point. And I think just keep an eye on the space in the coming months.
Okay, so future updates. That's why we're not seeing it.
Yeah, it says, I'm reading it right. It says updates and more information about temporarily disabling the SharePoint app will be shared in future Message Center posts.
Yeah.
Okay.
That means we're not comfortable rolling that part out yet.
Yep. Thank you.
Not a problem. Yeah, there was another part further down where they were talking about customizing, but the customizing that they were talking about was basically customizing the navigation on that communication site. So you weren't customizing it specifically to this, but when you customize one, it's mirrored in the other.
I think we just like to have ability to determine what shows in the app bar, but you don't have the ability to do.
Yeah.
And I don't know the outcome. A couple of my pals were working on this today, and I was just watching messages in Teams, and they were having a hell of a time disabling this with the PowerShell. The authentication problems, but they finally got it to work. I think, I couldn't tell you the exact thing, but I'm gonna find out tomorrow. They just had a wonderful time doing that.
Okay.
FYI.
Yeah, no, that's good to know. Anybody else, any questions about the SharePoint app bar? I kind of figured that this would be kind of a hot point. I mean, this is going to have a dramatic impact. It affects all of SharePoint, well, all of the modern sites, which hopefully is the majority of your SharePoint. But, all right. Okay, so that concludes our updates. We just wanted to give a huge thanks to our platinum sponsor, Turn Digital. Turn Digital takes care of us on a regular basis so that we can keep the lights on here and keep you guys informed, and we really appreciate that. And we are also really looking forward to hopefully someday in the future doing these meetings in person and allowing Turn Digital to buy us pizza, because that was wonderful when they were doing that as well. So looking forward to that. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to our main event. We're going to have a beginner's guide to creating custom connectors for Power Apps and Power Automate, presented by Greg Shoops. I'm sorry, Eric. My apologies. Take it away, Eric.
I will happily do so. Thank you, sir. I see the new sharing thing that they have. I'm not sure how I feel about that, but okay. Right. So hopefully everyone can see my screen. Bring up the full thing here again. See if it is in fact sharing.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
It is.
All right. Excellent. Good. All right. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Eric Shoops. I'm an Office Servers and Services MVP, or whatever they're calling us this particular cycle. They'll change the name on us again shortly. Been doing this SharePoint, the Office 365 thingy for a very long time. Long time. Too long, probably. I need to figure out what I'm going to be when I grow up. But until then, I'll continue doing this. For those of you who would like to reach out and get in touch with me, here is all of my contact information. I will be honest, I am not on the socials that much. Social for me is more about standing in a pub with a beer in my hand. And since we can't do that anymore, I do my best. So feel free to reach out to me. Worst case scenario, Dimitri always knows how to get a hold of me. So if you really have a burning question, I'm not responding to you, bug him and he can bug me. I believe, actually, the slides are already up on my slide share. If they are not, I will make sure and get that corrected and get those up there. You can always reach out to me on the LinkedIns. And the code that I'm going to cover with you today is already up on my GitHub repo. So you can go to github.com/eShops, look for the Conversionator app, and you will get all of the code that we're going to cover here today. We're going to try and do as much demo today as we can. There's a lot of stuff to go through, and in the interest of keeping everyone engaged, I've got some more advanced stuff at the end as well that we're going to cover. But we need to do a level set at the beginning for the basics. For those who haven't done these before, stick with me as we do a bit of yapping here at the front end to talk about that. And then we'll jump right into the demo and do a little fancy stuff at the end. So let's start with the whole premise here of the custom connector landscape. Most of you have probably used these already, or you've at least seen them as you're working in building a flow or a Power App. You've gone and searched for something like adding an email or converting a PDF or whatnot. And if it's not a Microsoft native connector, then it is, by definition, a custom connector. And really what a custom connector is a definition file that tells Power Platform how to connect to a remote API. And that's really what we're building here, is a interface between the Power Platform system on the back end and your system wherever it happens to reside, that hopefully has a REST API, but it can also support legacy SOAP as well if need be, but is described by something called an API definition, which we'll also refer to as Open API and Swagger. And this mechanism gives details to the system that tells it how your information is secured and what it connects to and whatnot. And the reason that you would want to do this is to extend the platform to either give it capabilities that it's missing or custom capabilities that you need in your environment that it doesn't quite provide out of the box, or you have some custom system that you've developed that you need to provide access to, and it just doesn't quite do the trick, or asking users to build web service HTTP connections is just too much of a hassle, so you want to streamline that for them. Lots of different reasons that you would want to build a custom connector, not the least of which is the fact that premium connectors, most of them, including ours and the one that we provide under the Aptigent brand, which is called Power Tools, are a pay-to-play type of connector, primarily consumption-based. And some of those, depending on what you're doing and who your vendor is, might get rather expensive, or you do so much stuff on the platform that the consumption-based APIs just break your budget. Considering what you're already paying to get premium connectors, sometimes that can be a little bit of the stick that breaks the camel's back, that just says, all right, this is way too expensive to do this. So you might want to go out and build one yourself. You must, of course, have the premium license to use custom connectors. That's a big downside to this, unfortunately. But once you have it, you can build your own connectors at no additional charge. So if there is a public API and you'd like to go out there and describe it, have your own connector, by all means do it, or connection to a backend system or what have you. Now, the framework for building these custom connectors consists of things that you kind of see and things that you kind of don't see. There is a very nice wizard for building at least basic connectors. We're going to walk through that here in a few minutes to show you how that functions. And that wizard builds connections that are applicable in both Power Automate and the Power Apps platform. It also covers Power BI, but it's slightly different. The apps you build for Flows and Power Apps aren't exactly the same as for Power BI, but the underlying mechanism is the same. I should point out to someone just mentioned Anantha. I hope I got that name right. Non-Office 365 app connectors equal premium. Yes, but also some of the Microsoft connectors are premium. So like the HTTP connector, premium, and some of the Dataverse stuff is going to be premium as well. So it's not necessarily external that they're getting you to pay for. I wish personally they would remove that restriction and allow all of the apps to be accessible without having a premium license, but we all know that that's probably not likely to happen considering how much they like to charge for these things. So unfortunate, but that is the state of play at the moment. Hopefully it changes in the future. Now, building a custom connector is comprised of these parts. They're the actions, which is the visual drag and drop components that you're going to see in the user interface. There's the or the descriptors for that. There's the description of what you're actually doing, some of what gets shown to the user, some of what doesn't. There's the underlying definitions component that describes all of your endpoints and your policies and whatnot. And there's your actual backend that does the work, the API that you're targeting. That's going to do the actual heavy lifting that you're interacting with, or run the webhooks, or is the service on the back end. Within the actual definition of the connector, and that's really all a connector is, it's a JSON document or a YAML document that describes all this different functionality. You have these differing components. starting with the base information. So what is this thing called? What version are you using? Where is it hosted? Is it HTTPS or HTTP? Why they even offer both, I don't know, because HTTPS is the only supported endpoint type. And what its input-output types, whether it's doing JSON or whether it's returning like multi-part form or what have you. Once you've described in general what the connector does, you then have the individual actions. These are the endpoints, so the things that it does. So it gives you, if you're, say, using the Azure Geospatial APIs, you're rendering a map, or you're getting coordinates, or you're doing a search. For most external APIs, this is a descriptive action like convert PDF or convert data format from one to another, or in the case of the one we're going to look at, converting a currency from one currency value to another. There are additional advanced things like triggers that you can do that are actually very cool. It is an advanced topic, so we're not going to cover it in depth here, but I do have some links in the documentation at the end so you could go and learn about what triggers do. You have to be very well versed in building a JSON or YAML spec in order to create triggers. There is capability for them in the UI, but in order to really make them work, you've got to write some raw JSON. So you have to be familiar and comfortable with the Open API spec and writing in JSON to build them. But they're really cool because you could do timed polling events where you have things that it goes out and checks on a regular basis, or you've got these webhook driven actions where if something happens, say the example that's in the documentation is a GitHub repo and someone checks something in and then that or puts in a pull request and then that runs a flow. And so those are capabilities native to the platform on the advanced side. There's some things that you would naturally build as part of a larger, more comprehensive API spec that would be normal coming from, say, an Open API Swagger perspective. So, for example, our product that we built is cross-platform, so our API is agnostic to the platforms. We build individual connectors for each one that we're working with, so we have a custom connector for the Power Platform, of course, but it doesn't directly support through the designer something called references. You'll use references a lot when you're building schemas, and I'll show you how those work and what they're for. But presently, there's no way in the designer to do that. You have to drop down to the Swagger and build it yourself. Bit of a hassle, but the good news is if you've built your API externally and you're importing it rather than using the wizard, it natively supports them. You can even drop to the Swagger and hand edit them in the wizard and it will accept them. There's just no wizard UI for it. And then finally, we have a cool piece inside of the platform for policies that allow you to modify runtime behavior. This is really cool. I wish some of the other platforms we support offered this, and I'll show you how this works and what they do. And they're really advantageous, and they are continuing to improve this and making some really cool things available from a policies perspective going forward. So there is quite a bit of work being done there to even further extend policies. Now, in the image that I have on this slide, you can see the basic skeleton of an API definition. We're going to build one from scratch, so you'll see each one of these pieces as we put them together, and you can start mapping in your head between what you're seeing in the wizard and what's in the underlying spec. This is important because the wizard is only going to take you so far. It is not going to get you to very complex object types. It's not going to get you references. You're not really going to be able to build triggers effectively. So if you don't know how to build a Swagger spec from scratch using JSON, I highly recommend that you go and get familiar with it. You can go to swagger.io for the SmartBear platform to learn, or you can go to the Open API. And the version that you are looking for is version 2. Not version 3. Version 3 support is coming, but it's not here yet. So you want to work with the version 2. It's a slightly different version or slightly different implementation from version 3. Fortunately, if you have built or have access to an Open API 3 spec, you can go to something like editor.swagger.io and it'll quickly convert them for you. You can use that to import for your custom connector in Power Platform. So in the beginnings of the API, the first couple of steps of the wizard, you'll do two important things. You'll describe your base, paths, and your schemes. These are the URLs that you're going to be accessing, including your root host, along with your security definition. We'll talk more about that security def when we get into the wizard. There's several different supported types. Primarily, you will be doing API keys or OAuth. If you have not done an OAuth app before and define that, there's a little bit of a learning curve there to understand what you need to make that work and how that gets defined inside of your specification. There's lots of examples. You just need to get the syntax correct. The meat and potatoes of your custom definition is your actions. These are your API endpoints. These are what do stuff that returns, takes inputs, and returns outputs to the application. So when you fill out fields in Power Automate, for example, and you plug in a variable here and a text value there and whatnot, those are the inputs to your paths in your API definition. And then the outputs get defined as your responses. You can see again on the side of the slide there that I have a skeleton of how this looks in the underlying JSON. Now, I personally prefer JSON because it's more syntaxually accurate, easy for a Texan to say, right? Like nuclear. But YAML is actually what people have standardized on. I can't stand YAML because I can't see tabs and returns, and I like my quotes in the right places and all that stuff. But I'm a developer, so that's why I like to see things. But you can take if you're more familiar or comfortable with YAML, or you're used to seeing YAML, you can take any JSON spec, go to editor.swagger.io, drop it in and convert it to YAML. Super simple. Some things you need to be aware of when you are crafting your definition. So these are very structurally accurate, or need to be structurally accurate. There are conventions that you must follow when you're building these specs out. It took me a few weeks, probably closer to a month, to really get a good handle on building a solid JSON spec. Fortunately, there's a ton of documentation on the OpenAPI site on exactly how to do this, and lots of examples. And I have included the full JSON spec with some of the advanced scenarios in my GitHub repo. There's also some examples in the custom connector documentation in the Microsoft docs. So there's lots of places to go to learn, but you must learn how to put these together, or you will face an uphill battle, and you need to know what goes where and how they function. For example, the methodology of describing your paths object, then your individual path, and then what type it is. Is it a get? Is it a post? Is it a put, patch, etc.? And then defining that in your descriptions and your operation IDs and your summary, etc. If you're grouping things together using tags, you'll put that in here. That's not actually currently exposed in the custom connector definition UI in Power Platform, but it is supported. Your operation IDs have to be unique within the scope of the definition. So you can have multiple similar ones, but each of the IDs has to be unique. So if you need slight variants of them, you can do that. You can put your parameters either, say, in a get operation in the URL using curly braces, or you can do them as, say, a post in the body or a body in a post operation. So a couple of different ways you can implement that. And you can even in your policies do some pre-processing of your parameters in your definition. And we'll look and see how that works as well. Just a quick slide about triggers, because we're not going to dive deep into these. It's an MS-specific OpenAPI extension. Point of knowledge here, anything in an OpenAPI spec that starts with X dash is a custom implementation for a particular platform. Every platform that supports OpenAPI will support these, but not all of them implement them. For example, Microsoft has an X-MS summary. They have a whole list of X-MS. You can see in the example, XMS notification content. There's several. that they support. Nintex supports in their open API spec for Nintex Workflow Cloud, supports all of the Microsoft implementations. But IBM, for example, who we use for our front end, has their own set of extensions, and everything is prefixed with X. So that's how you know you're working with a custom definition that may or may not be supported based on the platform that you're working with. Now, two types, I mentioned this already, of triggers. There's the polling pull model, where it's going to periodically query your remote API, and then the webhook push model, where you can call app events. These are not only are they challenging to build because it's a pretty complex JSON spec, but they're also really hard to debug in remote systems. And I would recommend, if you do need webhooks in your definition, start by building your definition completely end to end without your webhook. Get it working, get your security in place, get all your OAuth or API keys set up, your definitions, your paths. Make sure it's all working first. Once you've done that, then you can circle back and do your webhooks. Now, something you will use a lot, I already mentioned this, is the references. This is where you take a repeating element, such as an input definition or an output definition, and instead of redoing it over and over and over inside of your spec, you extract it. So let's say we're going to look at an example of this when we start doing our demo code. I have an enum that has a list of supported currency values. Well, if I have multiple operations, there's 20 currencies in the list, 20 odd currencies in the list. You don't want to have to type that over and over and over again. Plus, when you want to make a change, you don't want to have to do it in 30 different places. So references are an abstraction that allows you to reuse a component in your spec. In the UI, you'll see a node for it. It's grayed out. You can't build them in the UI, but they are fully supported in implementation. So you can build them in your JSON. There are further reference capabilities in OpenAPI version 3, such as you can abstract an entire set of enum values, which is just an array. That's not supported yet in OpenAPI 2. So I can't do an abstraction from an abstraction. But a single level of abstraction is supported, and this is good for both input and output parameters. And you'll see that'll make a little more sense when we look at how it's actually implemented in the spec. Now, finally, we have the policies. This is your pre-processing. This is a cool feature that allows you to do some manipulation on platform before it gets sent to the API. Example, let's say that you have two endpoints. One is your sandbox for testing, and one is your development environment. But you don't control the API spec. The developer built the JSON for the spec. They send it to you for implementation. You don't want to monkey with their code, and they have a fixed URL, as you must, in the spec. Well, I'd like to, in my test tenant, or my preview tenant, I'd like to target my sandbox environment. In my production, I want to continue to target dev. Well, policies give you that capability. They will allow you to set a property before it gets sent to your API. So the host, for example, you can change on the fly and substitute that out. You can convert some data types before sending it over. Maybe there's a custom header that's required that's not included in the definition, or that the user isn't passing in, or that you want to modify. All of those things can be done in policy. So they're very flexible, give you a lot of capability for managing your connector without necessarily having to change the API, or things that can't actually be changed in the API. Like if your API requires an object, but you're getting an array, you can't do anything about that in an open API spec, but you can do that with a policy. Now, finally, on the back end will be your API. Although I am going to show you an example, of course, of an Azure function running in Azure, and later on we're going to look at Azure API Management for doing throttling and management of that. There is absolutely no requirement on the platform or the technology other than it supports RESTful connection. That's it. So you can do whatever it is that you like on the back end, as long as you follow the requirements defined in the spec. So it takes an input, returns an output in the defined methodology that's specified in your definition. Okay, and so we'll show a quick example, but just be aware that it could be Python, it could be Node.js, it could be anything on the back end. There are no limitations around that. Few things to be aware of. So this is this stuff where I've already bruised my knee, and I'm going to help you out a little bit to stay within the rails. I mentioned this already. Get to learn the Swagger spec. Now you don't have to go become a Swagger wizard before you start building custom connectors, but you do need to understand how to, at some point in the process, how to write your own. Triggers are advanced. Work on them later. Debug and get it working, then come back to it. When you are testing this, I still get tripped up by this and forget to do this. You need to enable cores on your API endpoint. So a lot of times I'll go build a demo and put it out there and go to test. Why isn't it test? Oh, I forgot to enable cores. That's because the test mechanism built into the UI, along with the test mechanism on, say, the Swagger.io platform or any other test utility, are doing things in JavaScript. Thus, you need cores enabled on your endpoints. You have to do refs by hand. They're supported, but you have to build them yourself. I'll show you why this is important when we get into this demo. Policies are great. Learn them, learn how to use them. And finally, authentication can be difficult, especially if you haven't done OAuth before and you're not familiar with the OAuth standard and how to deal with all the different types of tokens and what you have to do. Start simple. Build a spec with basic authentication. A username and password is okay for testing only. Once you've got it working, then go back and graduate up to things like an API key. API keys are much easier to implement, pretty standardized. If you're going to need to do OAuth because the system demands it or your security requirements necessitate it, fine. At least you know that your spec is already working. Now you can go figure out how to implement the open API implementation of OAuth. Okay. All right. So that's a lot of setup, a lot of talking about what we're going to do. Let's go in and actually look at building a custom connector from scratch. So if I flip over to one of my demo environments, if I can find the right tenant, here we go. So here I am in Power Automate. And if you go under the Data tab, you can look at custom connectors. Now you can already see that I've built a few of these examples already, and then we're gonna pull a Julia Childs, which only the old people on this call are gonna get. Young people are like, who's Julia Childs? And we're gonna pull a baked one already out of the oven and show you how one looks in production. But let's start by building a new custom connector from scratch. Now, there's a couple of different ways that you can approach this. You could just start building it and walk through the wizard and let it guide you. You can create it from an Azure service. Yeah, sort of works. Not fully featured. You can import it from an open API file or a URL. Okay, that's good. If you've already built one, easy import. Or if you have a solution in GitHub, and there's a Swagger JSON file in there, you can pull it in from GitHub. We're going to start at the very basic level, which is creating one from blank. So we'll do test Boston, wish the Stars were in the playoffs. I'm not bitter, not at all. Ah, look at, they're going to cut off my, that's terrible. Terrible. Being discriminated against. All right. So I'm just going to update my little trial bit here. There we go. All right. So here's the beginning of the wizard where we define our information. So it's going to ask for things like a connector icon and a color. Now, this is not necessary or needed. It's not actually part of your open API spec, but it does help you recognize your connector in the gallery because there could be lots and lots of connectors in the gallery. And so it's easier to pick them out. And also, if you are going to end up publishing this for public consumption, whether it's free or paid, we're going to talk about publishing at the end, you want to have a logo. In fact, it is required that you have an icon in the publication and that it is unique. So you could give it a short description here. This is a really cool connector. And to answer the question from Russell, I don't know how often you can update the free trial. I keep updating and it keeps letting me. So until it tells me no, no idea. All right, so we could do something here like, so there we can go red as our background for our custom connector and upload an icon. Now, if you are connecting via an on-premises gateway, there's some setup that needs to be done for that. And for here, that's why there's a little checkbox when you turn this on. It's going to update your spec with some specific information. The scheme you want to use for production is HTTPS. It's all that's allowed for production, but you can, of course, do HTTP for testing up to a certain point. You really want to stick with HTTPS. Now, it's going to ask you for a couple things here, the host and the base URL. Now, it's tempting to put in our host like so, but it's going to tell you, no, that won't work because the host cannot contain the scheme. So if we take this off, you can see that it's doing live validation. It says, okay, that's good. Now, you can also have pathing here in the underlying specification, but notice that I tried to add a path and it won't let me in the UI. Now, that's technically a violation of the Open API spec. The Open API spec does allow the host to include a path, but the UI here doesn't want to do that. And I have to agree with Microsoft on this one. The spirit of the spec is to keep your host as a raw value, that the minimum it contains this and say a port, right? And that's it. So I think they did the right thing here, even though it's in violation of what the specification allows. The base URL is then the path that gets appended to that. So for ours, the one we're going to build, let me copy and paste in this long Azure Websites URL here. So I'm going to do that. And our base is going to be API. Now, when you're building this out, you can make some determinations here. We could, for example, include our version at this stage and say, okay, we're going to do API v1. There is a versioning methodology that is followed pretty much by all these RESTful API specs. And certainly if you're implementing Azure API Management, you're going to follow this as well. That has and you've probably seen this working with the Azure APIs, in that it will specify the version in the path. You can determine whether that happens at the base URL level or whether that happens down in the individual paths for each one of your actions. And the reason you may want to do it at the action level is, let's say I change an action at some point, and I change it from returning a string to returning a complex JSON object. Well, if I change my def and republish it, I'm going to break everyone who's using the existing definition. So I may instead want to change it to a /v2/ and then the name of my endpoint. That will allow the existing users of v1, even though I didn't specify v1 in the pathing, to continue to use theirs, and new users would follow the v2. This is a pretty common approach. So normally you would not include versioning in your base URL or your base path values, what it actually says in the underlying spec. But you may wish to do that if you had, say, two versions of the connector and you wanted to have a complete v1 version and a complete v2 version, but all the endpoints were named the same. You could then put your base URL in here. It would make a little bit more sense. All right, so we're going to keep it at API. We're going to move on to the next, and we're going to say, what is our authentication scheme? Let's start with something simple like an API key. An API key is going to want things like a parameter name and a parameter label. So I'll type in something like API key. And in the case of a Azure API Management my parameter name would be something like this. Each platform is going to have something different, or you may do pre-processing in your platform and keep it very simple. Typically, that parameter goes in the header, but depending on the API that you're working with, it may also go in the path. And please forgive me a little bit. It is allergy season here in Texas, and evenings tend to be when it's the worst. So I'm coughing and sputtering here a little bit. It ain't COVID. All right, so let's leave that here and let's move on. And now we are into defining our actions, our triggers, and our policies. Note, as I mentioned earlier, that references is here, but it's not. There's nothing you can do with it. Supported, but not implemented. Let's start building a new action. So for our action, we are going to have a summary for this. So let's call it convert currency. This will show up in the UI in Power Automate. Now, unfortunately, Power Apps uses that dotted formula type notation or expression syntax for implementing everything, including custom connectors. So you may go through a lot of effort to give nice summaries and nice definitions and everything to your endpoints, and then you get over to Power Apps and you realize you're just looking at raw JSON junk, and that's just the nature of the way they've implemented it in Power Apps. It's not nearly as user-friendly as it is in Power Automate. So we'll give it a description. So let's say we're going to calculate the value of money in a different currency. And we're going to give it a operation ID. Now this could be something and should be something like this. It needs to be unique within the scope of your definition, but it doesn't have to be unique. If you had a V1 and V2 and they were the same name, different connectors, fine. Yes, the custom connectors are available in Power Automate and Power Apps on the platform natively. You don't have to do any changes. They're just automatically supported. Power BI connectors are a little bit different. They use the same mechanism, but they're implemented in a different way because they do different things. So these won't show up there, and your Power BI ones won't show up here. Okay, now you can define visibility, and it tells you if you click the little Learn More, it'll take you over to what does this mean in the document. So important are shown to the user first, advanced are hidden, and then there's internal ones. And you've probably gotten used to seeing some of this in the UI as you're working and building flows. So that should be pretty familiar to you. This is where those are defined. So we'll say important, make sure they're all shown. Now, what we want to do is we want to craft our request and our response. Now, what's going to happen in this case is I'm going to ask for 3 fields. I need a number. This is our numeric value. Let's call it 100. And then I need a source currency and a target currency. So if I wanted to convert from US to Canadian dollars, I would say source US, target CAD, or source USD, target CAD. So my input is comprised of 3 things, a number and 2 strings. So I need to go and build this out in my request. So let's do a post, and in our URL, it's going to be convert currency. Notice how this stuff is all relative. What's going to happen, you'll see it here in a minute, is the system is automatically going to put together a fully qualified URL for you. That's why we're doing all this relative stuff as we go along the way. Now, are there specific headers? What does our body look like for a JSON object for this, for my inputs? So I'm going to describe 3 inputs here. So let's do, hang on a second here, let me get a full proper JSON object. There we go. And I'm going to paste that in over here. And here's my JSON object. Now you will note that I've described my type, which is a number. Here's my XMS summary for the operation and my description. Note, I've gotten a little fancy here in this second parameter for the source. It's a string. There's a default value of USD, and I described an array as my list of input values. This will give the user a drop-down list that they can choose from. It's specified as an enum. Could be a Boolean type, could be a number type. The spec actually allows you to define whether it's an integer or a decimal or whatnot. The Microsoft implementation only allows it to be called a number. And when you go to publish your definition, if you were to do it through ISV Studio, there's actually a test that it runs, and it'll tell you, hey, I won't accept this and I will accept that. Can it infer the schema from a sample? Absolutely, it can infer the schema from a sample, which, yes, is basically what I'm doing here. So you have to provide it this little body bit here, and that's how it will infer how this is built. So let me do a quick import, and you will see, let me go to the body. Whoops. Come on, show me the body. There we go. And you will see that it starts to infer what I'm allowed to have here. So here's my description, my type, my summary, all that stuff here. So you take your little sample out and you pop it in, and it starts building it for you. What's required, right? And it's going to validate it on the fly and make sure that that sample that you put in is, in fact, correct. Now, obviously, something is still going on, because there's the little exclamation mark over here. So what is it that it wants? Note here that it's put together the full URL. I just said a second ago it's going to build that for us on the fly, and here's where it's doing this. I don't have a response. I need to define some sort of response. Okay, so let's go to our default response. And again, we're going to give it some sort of response object for it to build from. So once again, I'm going to copy and paste some JSON. And there is my response object. So I'm telling it what type it is. Here's my description. Here's my summary. And you're going to see in the UI why these description and summary fields are important, because you've only got a limited amount of text to tell the user what you want them to put in. Very limited, in fact. For more complex things. So it's important how you describe these fields here. So let's do another import from there. And and it's saying wrong. My operation ID does not start with an uppercase letter. Now, this is silly because that's not in the spec. The spec doesn't demand that the operation ID start with an uppercase letter. That's a Microsoft thing. Why they do that, I have no idea. But it'll trip the validator there and say, you didn't pass validation. Baloney. We know it works. Okay, now, if I wanted to do triggers and things here, I could. Let me just show you policy and some of the cool stuff you can do with a policy, although we're not going to implement it. So this is my test policy, right? And I'm going to pick from a template. And here are the templates. Now, there's also a concept of custom templates. I'm not actually sure if they've implemented that. It's in the documentation, but I'm not sure if it's implemented yet or not. It may be a targeted release versus general release kind of thing. But these different templates let you do different things. So if I wanted to say set a property, I could say for my operation convert currency. I want to give a path to the parent property, and this could be something like /source, right? Type tonight. And then, what's my path relative to the parent value to add, etc. These aren't described very well. When you look in the documentation at how these are built, it will make sense when you see the JSON as to what they mean by what's my parent object and whatnot. What they're really saying here in this case is, let's say you have a get string, and that get string looks something like source $ID equal 1. Okay, well, ID is my parameter. So where is that relative to my parent? What is the value that I want to have? And when do I want to run this? Is it on the request or the response, right? So you're going and changing out some properties or modifying the properties. That's really what it's saying here as you're building that out. It's just not completely obvious from the descriptors here. But that's really what they're asking for. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete this one because we're not going to use it at the moment. Let's get to a completed definition. So here I have my def, Okay. So before we go on to the testing panel, let's peek beneath the hood and let's see what we've actually built. So here it is shown in YAML format. This is what we just did. And if you've ever worked with like the Swagger editor and the whole open source frameworks that all that stuff is built on, this should be very familiar to you on how this looks. In fact, this is the Swagger editor, Swagger IO editor implemented inside of the Power Platform Designer here, Custom Connector Designer. And it's a whole open source thing that lots of people use. So here's our information. You saw us fill in the title and the description, our host, our base path. Notice what's missing. No icon color. That's because those things are not part of our specification. They're part of our connector definition. That will make more sense when we go talk about publishing. There's other JSON files that describe the definition. Now, here's our path. We described our post, right? Our properties. Here's our summary. Here's my parameters in and out. Okay. Now remember the way that we implemented our input parameters was that we had an enum, and that enum had a bunch of stuff in it that you had to go and select from. Okay. Doing that over and over is a real pain in the rear end, and it actually did not import that properly because it's putting them in the wrong place. We'll go look at a correct one here in a minute. If I had multiple operations with all of this stuff here for this parameter, that's a lot of stuff to constantly be copying and pasting. And if you change it, making changes in multiple places, making sure you don't mess up. Thus the concept of references, where we're going to abstract that into this definition section down here, along with our input and output parameters. Okay, here's your API key that we've defined here, our security, and what that's going to look like in the header. And here's the little test utility where if this were functional, it would work. If we were to actually test this, we would need to put in a valid API key to go and do that testing. Okay? This is how the definition looks to the average user who's looking at a Swagger specification. So all the pieces and parts are down there, now there to actually create the connector. So I'll click create, and as soon as you've created it, it's available on Power Automate and in Power Apps. There's another way to get this done actually, which if you build everything in Azure API Management, you can do a one-click export to Power Platform that will pre-build your connector for you. Everything is there and it's just done. And it shows up in your custom connectors. Now, the good thing about things here that you've done yourself is that everything can be changed and across the platform in your own tenant, and you're not relying on an externally defined connector that you can't change. So of course, this is all obviously modifiable. All right, let's go to one that we've pre-built that we know is actually working, because although this one is a sample, I will actually do have a functional one. So let me go back here and let's go to the conversionator here. And this is the app. Okay, so let's go in and edit this. And you can see I have a little icon here, my background color, right? All the stuff we've already looked at. Let's go to the cool bits and look at the Swagger editor. Now, here in the Swagger editor, you can see my definition, okay, up here. This is much cleaner to look at. Here's my operation, convert currency, what it's going to do, and my parameters now have a ref to them. Along with my responses also have refs, because I'm probably going to have a basic string or a basic number response multiple places over and over. So you really want to abstract those down into a definition. So if I come down here to my definition, I can see I've created a input object called currency conversion, what type it is, what the required fields are, right? And here's my enums. Note that this is Swagger 2, not 3, so that I can't further abstract these enums. I have to retype them. Boo, hiss, that's terrible, but support for OpenAPI 3 is coming. The other cool thing you can do with the rest is provide an example of what it should look like. And this actually shows up in the testing tool. It will tell you what an input, let's come here to this, what an input should look like. So you can put in this example of it here so the user goes, oh, I kind of know what that means. Now, when I say user, let's be clear. The user who is building a flow doesn't see all this stuff. They see input fields that you show to them in the UI. The people who want more information about your spec, if say it's hosted in a public place like a Swagger or another place, another repository, GitHub, for example, they would go and see this implementation and see how these are put together. But they don't really see that so much in the UI, and you don't really want them to. All right, so we have our various information here. We should now, in theory, if we have an API key, we should be able to go and authorize and test this, and we've remembered to set cores. So just to make sure we're working, I'm going to jump over into Azure API Management, and I'm going to go into my subscriptions. We're going to come back to this here a little bit later, and I'm going to get my test subscription here. And I'm going to show hide my keys, and I'm going to copy this key. So let's come back over here into my custom connector. And when I click authorize, put this in. And with any luck, this is all still working. So let's close that. And let's try it out with the example. Execute. And if all's good, it'll come back with a 200 level response. Right? And there's my response. Oh, I got a 400. So probably I have the wrong API key, or I let something lapse in Azure API Management. But what it's doing here is it's following my response definition, saying when there is an error, you're going to return a response that's a string, right? And tell me what the error is that came back. And so I've got an invalid request in my error here for whatever reason. It's not honoring the request that I sent. Something I messed up somewhere along the way. All right. Oh, I forgot to turn on the cores. Although typically you get a cores error back that tells you, oh, I bet what I've done is I haven't refreshed my connection between Azure API Management and my Azure Function App. In fact, I bet my Azure Function App isn't even running and needs to be warmed up. That could be part of the problem here. So in any event, there's your testing tool. And so you can do testing of your API right here from the definition. Make sure everything is working before you go and try and use it in a flow. So now that we've, in theory, tested all this and make sure we're working, let's go over into our flows. And let's do a test of our currency conversion. So let's edit this flow here. And here is my connection. It's probably going to ask me to update that at some point. And let's go ahead and delete. Now I'll leave those the way they are because I'm going to use it for something later. So here you can see we described our inputs. So a value, here's my summary, a source currency and a target currency. Now when I go to add this action, so I'm going to do a quick search and I'm going to do conversion nator. And you can see there's a whole bunch of stuff that shows up in the list. There's lots and lots and lots of things here. If you go to your custom, it narrows that down to only the connectors that you've built. So aha, here is the convert currency. Now, I mentioned earlier about that icon being somewhat important, and that's because this list can get pretty out of control. For example, we have 82 operations in our Power Tools API. So if you just were to search for Power Tools or our Power Tools connector, you get a lot of stuff, right? Well, conversion also happens to be something that's in that. So if you wanted to use ours versus your own or versus some other one that's out there, that helps you to define helps you visually to pick out the ones that that you want, right? So I'm going to go back over here to my custom ones. We're going to pick this here. Note the fields by default are empty, and your definition description is what shows up right here in this replaceable text. But this is all the information that your user has. There's no way for you to tell the user at this point, hey, you need to put in a currency value pair using the internationally recognized ISO format for Forex currencies. It's too long. It's not going to fit. There's no place to do that. So you need to be clever with how you name it and what your very short fits in this little box here window is available to show the user. And unfortunately in Power Apps, that doesn't get shown at all. Well, sort of in the sort of IntelliSense in the little expression designer, but it's not very good. Note the enums here then allow me to define what those things should be, and I can pick my values, and there's even, I can go and insert variables here and say, I want to drop this variable in here and do my various pieces. When I want an output, for example, I can take the output from one of my connectors. Remember that each one is going to return an output type. Ours was a number, and I can take this and drop it into whatever it is I'm doing here, in this case, sending an email. Okay, so that's my connector implemented inside of Power Automate. If I were to go over to Power Apps, let's see if I still have one of my apps here for my conversionator. Surprised it hasn't given me another, another trial expired. Stand, still evaluating. It's not going to let me do that. I'm just going to make one up. I hope that isn't somebody's actual phone number. Well, it's not letting me. Click to extend my trial. Wow. Okay. That's interesting. Let's try. Wow. So I'm clicking on it, but it's not allowing me to extend my trial. That's highly, highly unfortunate that it won't let me. I wonder if they have an other. I can leave that blank and nope. Bummer, man. I thought it was in the +1 format.
Yeah, Eric, I think there's a certain number of times that you can extend it before they.
Yeah, I think so. And I've obviously so anyway, I was just going to show you real quick that in the Power App, you'll see your connector. There's sometimes you have to add the connector specifically in Power Apps. It doesn't have that search functionality that Power Automate does. So you go, you see that your connector is there, and then you can start building it out in your Power App and connecting it. So got to be a demo daemon somewhere, right? Not everything can go smoothly. Okay, so that's how we build out a definition and deploy it as a custom connector. Obviously, I have chosen a very basic example here for brevity and also for simplicity, and they can get a lot more complex than that, especially you put in triggers and policies and you start to get these pretty expansive definitions. They can also be pretty large. Ours is, I don't know, there's 5,000 lines of JSON or something in ours now. And so you can have some pretty complex connectors that you've defined. And you can also then take your next step from doing basic connectors and say, okay, I'm going to have 100,000 people using this, I hope. I really need to make this enterprise ready. So I'm not necessarily saying yet that I'm going to sell it or it needs to go into the connector marketplace or it's going to be publicly available. But I got a couple of problems here. One, I need to make sure that it's that I can throttle it, that it doesn't get overwhelmed, that my Azure functions are actually going to perform. I need to make sure that I have a place or a way to issue API keys, let people manage their API keys and subscriptions. I may even want to productize and manage this in versions. All of those are standard API definition requirements. Now, this is how our public connector functions from the front end to the back end for the most part. There's a lot of moving pieces here to take an API from, hey, here's a cool Azure function I built, to I'm going to take this public. So we start on the back end with the development piece, which is building our Azure function in Visual Studio, publishing it to a Git repository that then goes into Azure Devops. In Azure Devops, we're then going to publish it to an Azure web app or service. And so that Azure service then is instrumented with things like log analytics and application insights, so I can see what things are happening. I'm actually going to have multiple instances because I need one for testing and I need one for production. So I'm going to deploy to multiple apps. So I'm going to have different pipelines that do that. And all that is set up in, if I can get it to switch my screens back, all of that, it can be set up in your, I had it up here a few minutes ago. All that can be set up in Azure DevOps so that you have, here's our conversionator, and I have some pipelines for the conversionator, including my build pipelines, basic, dev, and prod, right? Or actually, this is my production instance. And then I have releases for both dev and prod. Let me step back to, let's go to the conversionator. Here it is. So I can go in and have my build pipelines, say what they do. Then I have releases where I'm going to push out in my release, say to my Azure App service. So in my task here, this is going to deploy an Azure App service and go push that out. And then I'll have one for dev or one for test and one for production, maybe even one for dev. And I may even secure them different ways. So for example, in our testing scenario, we have a dev that's secured as an Azure AD app. We have a test that's secured with API key, and then we have our production, which is also secured with API keys. Because it's a publicly accessible API, we have some security in front of it around web application firewall via Azure Front Door and the web application fire policies. You then have Azure APIM in front. Now in our public API, we actually do this through IBM as opposed to doing it through Azure because Azure APIM has a very, very poor, you could say non-existent monetization model. And user security model, and quite honestly, the developer portal isn't up to snuff for Azure API Management. But there's a lot of really good things in Azure API Management, and I'm going to talk about it in a second, because I do love Azure APIM. It's just not enterprise ready for public APIs that you're selling. But for using within your tenant and within your org, it's awesome. So then we have the platform gallery, where people consume stuff and how it's actually deployed on the platform. So that's all the various pieces. Now, there are things in addition to this that you want to do. You want to have policies for forwarding and routing and filtering. You may want to do some caching. You may want to do some pre-processing of inbound and outbound requests and even some additional monitoring. All of that can be done through your API management platform. But the most important one is subscriptions. If you have developers, you need them to use your API, even if it's for free. You have to manage credentials. They have to either create OAuth keys, or they need to create a singular API keys. Well, you have to have a place where they can manage that. You don't want to be doing that yourself. Plus, you need an API definition. If you're exposing this to devs, you want them to go out and be able to see it. Even if you're exposing it only in Power Automate and Power Apps doesn't have the descriptions and the summaries that Power Automate does. It's very developer-y. In order for users to know, there's no drop-down for your enums to say pick your proper currency value description or your proper date time format string. It's all an expression. So you need to have some place they can go to look at your documentation to see what it is they're supposed to be putting into those fields. Well, you can do that with Azure API Management. We saw that just a minute ago as I jumped over into APIM. Here it is. It's in your Azure tenant. You can go in and set this up. There's two types of tiers. There's a consumption tier and there's a dedicated tier. The big difference between consumption and dedicated, other than obviously what it says on the tin, is that with the consumption tier, you don't get the built-in developer portal. This could be important to you because that's where developers are going to go to manage, to do self-service, manage their API keys and their subscriptions. If you want to offer those, you need to be on the dedicated tier. The cheapest version, I think, is about $60 a month. And of course, it goes up from there depending on your consumption. The consumption tier, super nice because it auto grows, which is cool. But it doesn't have the developer portal with it. Big downside, I wish they would put the developer portal into the consumption tier. Having said that, this is the easiest and cheapest one to create. Yeah, internal dev, the consumption tier should be fine because you can do your own API keys and manage your own subscriptions and products. Easily done. There's several ways that you can define your APIs, okay? You can import an open API spec, just like we did in the custom connector. Or you can take what you built in your custom connector, go over here and import it into Azure API Management. Works great. You can do it from WSDL, from a WADL. There's different ways that you can do that. Or you can even, if you have a function app, import it. Now, if you choose to do this, ooh, that sounds cool. I'm going to go build my Azure function, and I'm going to import it into Azure API Management. I'm going to automatically get an API. Not so fast. Because what you're going to get from an Azure function, if we go and look at one, and I'll actually show you, here's the conversionator code behind the scenes. This is on my GitHub repo, along with the complete Swagger file for you. Here's my convert currency and what it does behind the scenes, okay? You have a function name, it does stuff. This is an HTTP trigger, okay? It's going to take a get or a post, and it's going to route this, have a convert currency. It's going to take my input values. It's going to do some stuff. I have a lot of logging in here, and it's going to return this numeric decimal response, which is just a class, some POCO classes that I define. Wunderbar, all great, but this doesn't include any documentation about the describing what the parameters are. There's no descriptions. There's no summary fields. There's no way to build a ref for multiple reused endpoints. You can't define a complete definition as an object. There's no host. There's no endpoint. It's very, very raw, and it's not a complete spec by any stretch of the imagination. There are things that you can use, community type things like Swashbuckle, that you can plug into your solution that allow you to decorate your functions with parameters that will allow it to build an API definition for you on the fly that is much better. And API Management, APIM, will honor Swashbuckle decorators and it will build out your spec. I have yet to build, and I've been doing these for a couple years now in production enterprise release. I have yet to build one that works the way I want it to when I get it into Azure API Management or into any API Management platform, or that will produce a spec that I can just go import into a custom connector. It just, you're going to have to hand edit them at some point. We hand edit all of ours. The good news is, as somebody has already anticipated in the chat thread in the question, is that once you are in Azure API Management, you can modify your specification. So I have an API. This one I've imported. I can now go in and define that API. I can set policies on the overall API. Remember before I mentioned CORS. CORS is important. I can't test from the test utility unless I've enabled CORS. I can enable CORS on an individual endpoint value, or I can do it here in the spec. So I can set my inbound processing, say what headers I want to allow, what origins I want to allow, and I can define my CORS here. But you got to turn this on if you want the test tool to work. So I can set these global policies on all operations. I can even do outbound processing. There's a bunch of stuff you can do here. The base, this is all XML, and you can go in and you can edit the XML. There's pretty good documentation on what you can do here. All kinds of things, throttling and processing, and it's all done in these XML defs here. And I can even drop down to the post or to the operation itself. And here's where I can start decorating that. Here's my name, my display name, my description. So if that's not coming out of your API definition, edit it here. I can say where are things in the query or the headers? What is my request? Here's my content type. Here's a sample. Here's my definition, right? You can build all of these out in Azure API Management. And in truth, what they've implemented in the Power Platform Wizard is just a wizardized version of what you can do in Azure APIM. And at the end of the day, et voila, you can always drop to the Open API Swagger spec, and you can handwrite this stuff yourself. Okay? All of that is available here in API Management. The coolest bits of APIM are the policies that allow you to do things like throttling. So if you were to want to monetize this API, you would want to say, I sell 100 executions for X and 500 executions a day for Y. You implement that with policies in Azure APIM, which allows you to do things like create a product. And that product, see if it'll allow me to edit it while it's published. That product is comprised of APIs. And you can define, does this need a subscription or doesn't it? A product doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to go and sell it in the marketplace. What the product means is that you're grouping an API together or a set of APIs together into a single unit. And that unit is the API keys and whatnot are going to be applied against that product. So you say, okay, here's where I'm turning subscriptions on or off. I can also do approvals. So if you're an Azure APIM, if you have the right Azure APIM role, you'll get email notifications saying you need to go approve a new subscription or what have you. And the users can see it in the developer portal. You can pick which APIs are included and even set policies at the product level, in addition to at the API level and at the individual operation level. And here's where you manage your subscription. So question was posed earlier, can we use this internally to manage our subscriptions manually? Yes, of course you can. And this is here where you would do that by adding and modifying subscriptions for your internal development team. So don't let the fact that it says product throw you off. You're going to use this in when you're creating an API management instance for your enterprise. You also manage overall subscriptions here that are not tied to products. These would be like your test keys and the things where you just want to all up. Or if you don't want to do products at all, that's fine. You can do that here. You can target towards backends, resources. If you're lots of things in Azure are Azure aware. So for example, if you're building an Azure front door policy, it's Azure APIM aware. So it can automatically choose APIM as one of its defined policy targets because it's a known endpoint, and it will allow requests to come in from APIM when you're securing your API. If you want to group your operations together with tags, which I highly recommend if you have a complex API because it helps in the documentation, people see things easier. If you're doing OAuth, you can describe your OAuth parameters and operations here. You can set up an OAuth server in Azure to serve as the backend for OAuth, and you would define all of your operations here for OAuth, and if you did, and add all the stuff that you have to set up for that, right? And what needs to be done, what are the token endpoints and all that sort of thing, client credentials, et cetera, et cetera. So all that is here to set up, right? You can do application insights and whatnot. And if you look at, let's do an APIM developer just to show you what this looks like, because there's lots of examples out there of people who have done them. Well, that's picking a competitor. That's wrong. Let's find, here we go. So here's the sample. That's the old school one. That's V1. Let's find a V2 portal. Got a link to one up here. I know we'll find one here in a minute where somebody has developed. I better put Azure. There used to be a couple right on the front page. You can see that people are hijacking the search terms to try and get competitors some first page posting. Well, you could go look some of these up. There's some examples out there of some Azure API developer portals that well, here's someone who's customized one. So they've changed the UI. This is Azure Api. It's built with something called Paperwhite, which is a Node.js thing that was actually created by some ex-Microsoft folks. There's a whole editor. You could put this together yourself. It's really, really simple and easy to do. There's a whole UI for it. But it automatically talks to the Azure Api APIs. So Api, of course, has its own set of API endpoints. And it pulls your products and all your subscriptions and all of your API definitions. And it does, if you have an API defined, it will show you all the operations and you can do the testing and everything. Let's go to the APIs here. So here's an API that they've defined. And here's their API def. They have one get operation. Here it defines. And if this should start to look familiar to you, here's your testing operation for that. All this is pre-built for you. You don't have to do anything except potentially customize the UI as they've shown here, change the logo and the colors, but it's all there baked out of the box. What it doesn't do is if you want to charge for your APIs, then you're going to have to go to a different platform, or you can build your own. There's some sample code for that, and all of this stuff that it's doing is driven by the Azure Api Management APIs. Okay, so you build your own if you want to, connect it to your WordPress site or something else, the static web or an Azure web app, the MVC application that you built, and go to town. And it doesn't do anything in here. In fact, there's a GitHub repo for this. You can go to the GitHub repo. You can get the developer portal. You can customize it yourself. I started down that road and realized it was a dead end for what I was trying to do, but all of the APIs that it uses are described in there for Api. So lots of stuff that you can do. Now, the final piece, I'm gonna go really fast. I know we've been talking for a long time here. The final piece is, let's say that I do actually want to take the next step and I want to do a public connector. Either I want to sell it or I want to do one to help out the community, which the Power Platform Connector team would love to have you build some community connectors. We have a monthly call that anyone is welcome to join, that they call a town hall, I think. And they talk about the features and things that are coming up and what they're doing on the platform, and they take a lot of feedback. It's mostly ISVs like myself, but you're welcome to go on and do things, and they love to have you build some community connectors. So here's what you need to do. First of all, create your custom connector in your own tenant. Fully build it out. Test all of your endpoint operations in Power Automate and Power Apps. Build a custom connector as if your customers were actually going to use your tenant. Upload your icon. Set your background color. Make sure all your operation IDs are correct. Make sure that your URL is the public URL that you're going to use. Set everything up as if it were production. Because the first step in publishing to the platform is there's a command line utility called PACon that you can get from their GitHub repo from the Power Apps team. That PACon, the first thing that you do when you set up the CLI is you download the custom connector from your repo, and it builds out a set of JSON files for you that include the manifest and all the packaging and stuff that you need. There's some modifications that you have to do that. There's a whole set of instructions. We're not going to go into it here. I actually have a separate presentation where I go through all of the ins and outs of building on Api and publishing and all that sort of stuff. But and I think that presentation is up on my slide share. I took some of the slides out and put them in here for you. But there's a whole process you have to go through in modifying the package and creating your own package. But step number one, you have to have it in a existing tenant for it to download from. That's your beginning point. Once you've modified it, then you can go to ISV Studio. And from ISV Studio, you can submit your package for review. When you start the process, it tells you what to do at each stage. Okay, you've done this. Now go do this. That gets manually reviewed by human beings. They will come back to you and say, we need you to adjust this, or are you doing this, or why is this that way? The feedback is excellent. They're really, really good on that team about giving you feedback on your connector. Once they've approved it and everything looks good, and they're going to ask you to test it. So they're gonna pardon me, ask you to provision a preview tenant. You're going to do a preview tenant. They give you instructions on exactly what type of tenant to deploy. They're going to push it to the pre-release ring, and in that pre-release ring, you have to go do testing. Your complete API has to be tested. You test there, or your complete definition, I should say, which of course by extension tests your exposed endpoints of your API. You test it there. You say, I'm done. I've tested it. It's all good. You then have to go down, do a pull request in the open source GitHub repo for your connector. Doesn't matter whether it's a paid or a free one. You still have to publish it to GitHub because the documentation is considered open source. That's how the documentation gets on docs.microsoft.com. It's from that GitHub repo. The final stage is they roll it out across all of the regions, and it takes about 7 to 10 days to roll out across the region, right? So I went through that really quickly for you. In the slides, I have some more references and some links, as you can see here, on where to go and get these things, what's contained in the file, what you need to do. Actually, the documentation for this process is really, really good. It steps you through what you need to do at each stage, how you need to test it, what the testing tool is going to show you, et cetera, right? And you may find some problems, need to fix them, go back, resubmit. They'll review it again. So you may have to go through that loop a couple times until you get good at the process, and then you'll finally be good and ready to go for release. Let me just show you, just give you an idea of kind of, whoops, go back, what that looks like. Here's ISV Studio. And you can see that I have ones that we've already published here. So here's our community free version of Power Tools. It's already published. If I wanted to submit a new version, I'd have to go through the same process. Now, coming to this platform, you can see the telemetry thing kind of going in and out, trying to grab some data. This isn't fully in general release yet, but for publishers like ourselves, they provide data on utilization of your connector, how many operations, what operations have been used, blah, 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 blah. That's getting better. It's all connected to Power BI. More of that is coming down the pike. It's not awesome yet, but they're working on awesome. It's getting better. When you go to submit one, you go through this process of uploading the JSON file, giving them credentials so they can log in and test and expose it, and you define it and whatnot. Or you can do it in via GitHub repo. So you just walk through this process. There's an activity center here. So anytime you get feedback, it shows up in the activity center, and you just go here and communicate with them back and forth. Little teams like chat that goes through the process until they finally say, you're golden, you're good to go. We started your rollout. And then you just wait to get the updates. You'll get emails as well that'll say, now you're deployed to Asia Pacific. Now you're deployed to Europe except the UK. Now you're deployed to the UK. And so it rolls out in stages. The fastest I've ever had to do it is in about 4 days. It usually takes a little bit longer than that to roll out. So be prepared for it to get published. And again, it doesn't matter whether it's free or paid. Bear in mind, Microsoft is not monetizing your connector. There's no Microsoft store. There's a connector gallery where you can go and look at all the connectors that are out there. But there's no store. It's not like the Office store, the App Store, the Azure Marketplace. It's just a gallery. So Microsoft's not taking a cut of your money. You whatever mechanism that you use to monetize your platform, if customers need to go there and sign up and get an API key and give you a credit card, you need to put those the steps to do that in your documentation, in your intro MD file, so that people know where to go and what to do, what the steps are to get started. So that monetization is strictly a back-end process. It's not a front-end process that Microsoft controls, which in the end is actually a very good thing because it gives you a lot more flexibility. Okay. That was a crap ton of information, I know, and a lot of stuff to go through, and some of it I went through real quick. So here's a few things. GitHub repo. Go grab the repo. It'll give you the Azure Functions code, which is no big shakes. It's some just basic code that calls another REST API on the back end. But if you haven't done an Azure function before, it's a good starting point. Also the Swagger file with the references, so you know you can go and look and say, how did Eric build that enum thing with the dropdown and whatnot again? It's all in the JSON, which is in the GitHub repo. So you can go grab that. All of the documentation for overviews and walkthroughs is there. You can go get the docs. I wrote this was, gosh, what was it, 2 years ago? A while ago. I wrote a complete, maybe it was last year, I wrote a complete step-by-step walkthrough, soup to nuts, on building custom connectors for the Collab magazine. So there's a link for that if you'd like to just go get a bit more narrative about that or a refresher. And then finally, how do you submit and go through certification? The publication link for that, for you to go and learn more. So let me wrap up with just a final statement here. This seems a little bit daunting. There's a lot of stuff here, and you got to know JSON and Swagger and OpenAPI. And, how do I get all these pieces working together? But honestly, at the end of the day, we publish from multiple platforms: Salesforce, IBM, Nintex, Appian, a bunch. The process for the publication on Microsoft is one of the easier ones. Nintex is the simplest, but it's also the most basic. Salesforce is the hardest, but a lot of stuff you got to go through Salesforce. This is actually not that difficult in the overall scheme of things. And once you get used to the process, you've done it a couple times, it's actually easier than it looks. It's one of those things that looks like you're trying to boil the ocean from the outside, but once you've done it a few times, the devil in the details here is the OpenAPI spec. If you can get good at writing an OpenAPI spec and comfortable looking at the JSON and knowing what's what, you're going to be able to do custom definition or custom connectors like that off the back of your hand. It won't be any problem for you it's kind of like building SPFX. Once you get used to the Node.js tools and TypeScript, the rest is pretty much downhill, simple stuff from there. So I'll go ahead and end there. And if you have any questions, feel free to either put them in the chat or come off mute and ask them, and I'll be happy to answer them for you, if I can.
Hey, quick question. Do you know anything about, I heard that earlier this year, they said that if we published any API to Azure API Management, we could use it freely from within a Microsoft Teams environment?
I have heard some conflicting information. The first information I heard publicly available that was actually at a session at Ignite was, not the most recent night, the one before that, was that publishing the direct publish mechanism from Azure API Management to a custom connector, if the backend was going through an Azure function, or basically if you stayed inside the Azure thing, and maybe it was Dataverse that they said on the back end, did not require a premium connector license. And that may or may not be accurate anymore. I have heard something about Teams. I don't know what the specifics are, but Teams doesn't use the custom connector framework. So I'm not sure why that would even apply to Teams. That's a Power Platform thing. So maybe there's some messages getting muddied there. And I'm not sure what the actual end result of it, and I'm sure it's going to continue to change. What I think they were trying to promote is that you can one-click publish from Azure APIM, but there's some caveats there I remember them mentioning. I'd have to go back and look at exactly what it is, and the guidance may not have changed since then. So might want to check. I will tell you that the Power Platform Connector team is exceptionally responsive. They're very good at getting back to you if they know stuff. And they, in one of our previous town halls, I was talking to them about some of my frustrations with Azure APIM, and they work with that team. And they we're going to take some feedback directly to them. So I would say the place to start to get the honest truth there is with the Power Platform Connector team. Reach out to them on their blog or their social channels. They have a Twitter as well, and get it from the horse's mouth.
Yeah, okay, thanks. I got to do that. I was messing with this stuff, and I thought I heard that earlier, and I think they're bribing people to develop on Teams. I think that's the ultimate motive, to get everyone to develop on Teams. We'll make it free for now. That's just my thought.
I don't understand the Teams angle, because Teams so far hasn't been using custom connectors, and I haven't heard.
Yeah, I don't understand. It seemed odd, but
maybe it's coming. Don't know.
Thanks. Great presentation.
You bet.
Yeah, great job, Eric. I think that was very helpful.
All right, so I'm going to flip it back to y'all.
All right, very good. Thank you very much, Eric. And I especially appreciate that you ended on that pep talk. I think that was well warranted. So I know I was feeling a little overwhelmed at that point. So. Awesome.
So I'll hang out in the chat here for a few minutes. If anyone else has any other questions, I'll be happy to answer them. But otherwise,
Yeah, that'd be great. We also have we hang out at the end of this after we turn off the recording. So please feel free to join us for that as well, if you have the time. All right, can you guys see my screen?
Yep.
Yes.
Excellent. All right, so I just wanted to hit everybody up, see if anybody's having, outside of any custom connectors, if anybody's having any other issues with Office 365, SharePoint, Teams, Power Automate, Power Apps, anything? Anybody? Any questions?
I see Arthur has his hand up. Arthur, go ahead.
I have a question. A number of my clients have come up with a problem in Outlook. They're using the Office 365 email, and suddenly the autocomplete or nickname feature is not functioning anymore. I had about 6 people in one day report that. Has anybody seen anything? Was there some sort of special undocumented feature update?
I haven't heard anybody mention any issues like that in any of the tenants that I manage. But what you can do, you can open a ticket with Microsoft and actually ask them to put in a request to rebuild the GAL. And they can send a command over to do that.
Oh, okay.
That's done server side, and there's been some back and forth as to whether or not we're able to send those commands via PowerShell or not. But yeah, you can definitely open a ticket and have them rebuild the gal for that. That could be a part of that. Otherwise, now it's only going to be the gal if it's affecting absolutely everyone. Otherwise, you mentioned the word nickname, so I presume that you know that there are nickname files that are stored locally.
Right.
Those sometimes get corrupted. So if it's just a couple of people that are having issues with that, then you can just purge those nickname files, and then Outlook will rebuild them the next time it restarts.
Oh, okay. Yeah, now they've changed the name to autocomplete or something.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. It was just a whole series of people within a couple of days. I said, very strange.
Were there a lot of changes made to email addresses, or like a swath of new people hired, or a new domain that was added?
No, nothing.
Okay.
Nothing interesting.
Interesting. Okay.
Okay, good.
Those
Thank you.
those types of things frequently will trigger gal issues or corruptions. Anything else?
Looks like we have another question from Jeff. Jeff, go ahead.
Yeah, it's kind of a mixture of what we're doing here, but trying to do a Power Automate script and have a bot post to a channel, but that bot, the channel is private. Any ways of getting around that?
Ooh.
When you say bot, Jeff, are you referring to a flow or are you using
Yes,
Power Automate desktop? Okay.
a Power Automate flow.
You know, I haven't tried that. Are you getting an error message when you try?
Yeah, it doesn't let it do it.
What context is the flow running under? Is it under your account?
Yes, I mean I can send the message to the channel easily with my account because I'm a member of the channel. It's a private channel, remember.
Mm-hmm.
How do you get the bot to be accepted as a member of that channel, or can you?
Yeah, so I found an item on user voice that is complaining about the same lack of functionality.
Yeah.
And a number of people are supporting it. So it looks like it's just as impossible using the out-of-the-box connectors now. Now, if you were to build a custom one,
how do you do
well, I think Eric just walked us through that. You might gain better luck with the Teams APIs, but I haven't looked into it personally.
Okay. Yeah, I was hoping this team would have like, oh yeah, that's next week in the next release.
Yeah, definitely go and vote on it on user voice. There's 160.
I have, because I also went to user voice and found that, and the problem is a lot of those like 2018, 2019, so I don't know whether they've been changed since then.
Yeah, I mean, just as a rule of thumb, using private channels is generally not a good idea. But yeah, if you have them, I can see why you want them.
This is a situation we have a lot of Teams trainers, Teams ambassadors, I should say, is what we call ourselves for the company that I work for. We're trying to roll this out to 68,000 employees across the company. So we have mentors, and this is a trainer site or trainer channel that we only want trainers to get into. So it's basically we created a flow that would a department would create a form or enter a form and submit it, and it would automatically kick off a message to the channel saying, "Hey, we have a new request." I can easily do it with my name as the from, but I want the bot to be sending it, not me.
Right, but I guess what's the driver for making the channel a private channel?
I don't control it. It's because they only want certain people to get into it, just the trainers that are part of this thing.
Yeah, I mean, I would propose pivoting and maybe having another team created just for the trainers, and then maybe add, additional context.
Okay, a full team.
Yeah,
that's interesting. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I mean, behind the scenes, private channels cause all sorts of chaos. It actually provisions a separate SharePoint site collection just for each private channel. And there's a lot of other weird restrictions that come into play. I typically advise away from private channels unless there's a specific use case where any other solution would just not be feasible.
Okay, but I like the idea maybe a team, but we're trying to have one big team for the whole area because we have people that are in all levels of becoming mentors. So we have every quarter we invite 200 people in to start learning about teams at a high level, and they go through levels to get through their training until they become ambassadors, and then they can become trainers later on and mentors. So it's a escalating skill level.
Yeah, one more thing that kind of comes into mind is the new Viva Learning pathways, or Viva Learning rather. So there's currently a public preview available. I'll paste the link to that into the chat window here. But this essentially will allow you to build learning paths within teams, and essentially, kind of like a very light LMS to help your employees get onboarded onto different technologies and whatever collateral that Microsoft provides, or you can add your own as well.
Okay. I mean, we work with Microsoft directly, and they have their experts coming in. We have meetings with them every other day, pretty much. So.
Yeah, so Viva Learning is a new product that's going to be coming out later this year. So if you're kind of rolling out the structure now, definitely take a look there. That might add some value in terms of how you're planning things out.
I appreciate that. Thank you. I'll check it out.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Dimitri. And by the way, I 100% back everything Dimitri said there. We recommend to all of our clients to avoid private channels at all costs.
Now you tell me.
Just do a second team.
Like I say, we have a company of 68,000 people trying to learn teams.
Yeah.
And we're all different levels.
Yeah, that can be a challenge. Well, you should send them all to us.
Or build a champions Yammer community within your company and make it like Office 365 champions community in the company.
Yep.
Yeah, that's so we had. Well, it used to be called champions, but that got taken up by another area. So now we have to call ourselves ambassadors.
All right. Anybody else? Any questions, tips? Anybody figure out anything super cool in the last month or so? No.
I figured out how to get into these meetings.
Oh, that's good.
It took me a while. Eventbrite's not very friendly.
Hmm.
When you're on a laptop.
Okay, that's fair.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
Is there an easy way to actually create custom roles in SharePoint and publish across all the SharePoint set? Is site scripts the right way, or there isn't?
Yeah, I would say site scripts
That's
are probably going to be the best way to approach that.
Okay. The next question is, we want to create a custom role where the developers can modify the site pages and customize it, but not have the ability to add, remove members or add third-party apps for security reasons.
Yeah. Have you looked into creating a custom permission level?
Yes, I did actually. I did look into custom permission level. I cloned the designer role and added manage web access levels. It seems to fulfill the challenge. Is it still allows the custom role to add, remove members?
Still add and remove members. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't think the custom roles get granular enough to do those two things, because you need for your designers, you need some pretty high level access for them to be able to do the stuff that you want. But then adding and removing members is a relatively basic level permission. You may need to come up with a combination of security policies and custom roles to kind of meet the standards that you're looking for there.
Okay.
So, can you share what are your designers doing in that pages library?
So it's just like creating new site pages, removing site pages. That's it. Like it's nothing crazy. And the designers also need to have the ability to add the site to the hub site. So we did make them as the hub site admins so that they can add remove from the hub site. The challenge is if we don't add those permissions, we are not getting the site information page. And without a site information page, initially I tried to actually give custom access to site pages document library and not actually have a custom role. The problem is they're not getting the site information tab. Without the site information tab, you can't add to the hub site.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're in a difficult situation because you're looking to give levels of access that require the site owner level, but at the same time, you're trying to block other things that the site owners would traditionally have access to. My only recommendation would be to get away from using the SharePoint interface and build either a custom web part or build some flows to go and manage these things that they can call these actions from a different location, and then have like a service account that has the right level of access to go and execute on it.
Yep, Audit sounds good. That seems to be appropriate.
Yeah, Eric, unless you know of another way to block some administrative features.
No, I don't.
Yeah, and just one more thing you can consider. So in the unified audit logs, you can specify by URL or by user and audit the different types of actions that are performed. So if you wanted to perform any kind of permission changes, let's say on a weekly basis for that URL and that set of users, it's a manual process unless you script it, but you'll at least be able to retroactively see if they've made any changes.
Okay. Sounds good. We are trying to move away from permissioning at the individual member level. So we are trying to use mail-enabled security groups for all of our SharePoint access, especially for communication sites, so that the operations can be streamlined.
Yeah, no, but the audit logs would still the audit logs live on the tenant level.
Okay.
So you need to be a global admin to get to them. And within those audit logs, you can trace back anything that's happening in your tenant on a user by user basis. Okay. So leveraging that, you'd be able to look back to see if there were any permission changes on a given SharePoint site, or if they were performed by a given user, presuming you have a set list of designers.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. Is there a email thread or like a team for our user group so that we can just chat or communicate, or what's the best mechanism?
Yeah, we used to have a Yammer group when we first started this user group, but ultimately it was just one more place people had to go to look at things. So unfortunately, we don't really have any place that's maintained at the moment. But if you if you go on our social platforms, either on Twitter or on LinkedIn, people do tend to check into there time to time.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah, great questions.
Awesome.
Okay, Mike, let's keep rolling.
Yeah. All right. So now we are up to our community events. So I've done a little bit of reorganizing of our community events. So there's going to be lots of places for potential updates. So let us know what you see. So upcoming events. For this page, we're doing basically just the really big kind of annual events or potentially one-off events is what we're listing here now. So we've got M365 coming to Chicago on June 4th. We've got the Microsoft 365 Collaboration Conference that runs from June 8th to the 10th, and that's actually in Florida. Are they actually doing that on site? Does anybody know? I hadn't noticed that before. Interesting.
I recall seeing something that they were trying to consider doing it hybrid, but I'm not sure if that was decided on.
Wait, which one are you talking about?
SharePoint.
No, the M365 collaboration conference.
Collaboration.
That's going to be hybrid.
That is hybrid? Okay. Okay, cool.
I think you might have the wrong URL there, though, Mike.
Yeah,
I'll paste the right one in the chat.
Yeah. We'll correct the deck before we publish it on our site. And then SharePoint Fest is coming July 26th through 30th to Chicago. And the North American Collaboration Summit is going to be in August, the 9th through the 11th. And that's going to be in Branson or online. All right. Are we missing anything? I'm going to skip over the are we missing anything because I need to move that to 3 slides from now. So here we have a slide for all of Microsoft's community calls. This was something that we talked about a couple of months ago. They've been doing some really amazing work on these community calls. I join in on at least 3 or 4 of these, or at least I try to. Really, really great stuff. Incredible wealth of information for stuff like this. If you've got these really crazy out of the box questions, these are the place to bring those, and also to learn, you know, whatever the warrior horses are up to, which is awesome. Okay, and you can get links to all of this stuff over at pnp@github.io. And then we have other reoccurring community events. So these are events that are largely run by either non-Microsoft personnel or Microsoft personnel when they're in their off hours. There's a lot of good stuff there. I didn't have time to completely flush this out. I'm sure there's lots more stuff that can go on this page. So please send us some ideas. Eric, you mentioned a round table. If you could send us the information on that or put that in the chat, that would be great. And yeah, so Women IT Pros meets monthly. We've got Power Addicts, which is also monthly. And we've got Laura over at the Power Hour, and that's almost every Wednesday at noon is what it looked like from her schedule. And almost all of these things on the last 2 slides, almost all of them have YouTube channels that they use to catalog all of their previous events. So lots of stuff that you can go back, and there's a huge wealth of information out there. So whatever pains you, you can probably find a solution on YouTube or join a live call if you're not finding anything on the internet. All right, and then our traditional user groups. We've got the Rhode Island user group, Rhode Island SharePoint user group. They meet on the first Tuesday of every month. You can check out their meetup page for joining information. We've got the Harvard Office 365 user group, and they meet the last Wednesday or Thursday of every month. And we've got the Granite State SharePoint user group, which meets the first Thursday of every month. And This page got a little bit thinner because I validated who was still running meetings. But the Boston Azure meetup group is still running very strong, and the Power BI user group is still very active. So now, at the end of all of those slides, are we missing anything? You know, what are your guys' favorite sources for knowledge for Microsoft 365 info?
I think that's pretty comprehensive, Mike.
All right, cool. Well,
My favorite
if you
is this
guys
group
think
right
of stuff,
here.
let us know. You know, we'll throw it up on here, and you know, we like helping out our fellow community members because they're doing some amazing work out there. All right. So with that, we want to give another huge thanks to our platinum sponsor, Turn Digital. They help us keep the lights on and keep things rolling smoothly here, and we really appreciate that. So thank you to Turn Digital. And also a thanks to all of our previous sponsors over the past years. Been very helpful and wonderful in their support. And now it's the time that we've all been waiting for, the raffle.